Welcome to Quietly Reflective. Tonight, we travel quietly to Dalserf, a village held close by the river, where history does not shout, but waits beneath the surface. Here, old stones remember saints and settlers, Vikings and martyrs, faith and fear, and the long silence of those whose bones may still rest beneath the floor. This is not simply a story of a place. It is a nighttime walk through memory, along the edge of water, worship, and time. So settle yourself where you are. Let the day loosen its grip, and come with me to Dalserf, the village the river keeps. Prologue. The village the world forgot, and the river that did not. There is a village in the Clyde Valley that is very easy to miss. Not because it is hidden exactly, not because it is difficult to reach, but because it does not announce itself. A short turning from the A72, a narrow road, a row of cottages, beautifully kept, a stone church in an ancient graveyard, a bend in the River Clyde where the water curves around the land as if unwilling to let it go. That is Dalserf. Small, quiet, almost impossibly still. A place you could pass 100 times without realizing how much history has gathered there. And yet, if you leave the main road, if you follow the lane down towards the river, if you stand in the old kirkyard and listen long enough, you begin to feel it. The depth of the place. The sense that the village is not as small as it looks. The sense that the visible houses and the church and the graveyard are only the latest layer of something much older. Something that has been written and overwritten century after century by water, faith, fear, burial, memory, and loss. Dalserf is one of those places where history does not stand upright and wave for attention. It lies low. It sits beneath the grass. It waits under floorboards. It hides in place names. It keeps itself in stones that weather slowly in the rain. And all the while, the river moves past. The Clyde. Not yet the industrial river of Glasgow, not yet the wide, ship-haunted water of docks and cranes and empire. Here it is quieter, greener, older feeling. It bends around Dalserf with a kind of patience. The church sits close to it, the graveyard close to the church, the dead close to the water. In the dark, you can imagine the sound of the river reaching everything. The roots of the trees, the foundations of the kirk, the old stones, the unknown bones, the names that can no longer be read. Tonight we are going to sit by that river and listen. Because Dalserf has stories, not loud stories, not stories that arrive with trumpets and banners, but the quieter kind, the kind that survive because a place refuses to forget them. Stories of saints and early Christians moving through a valley that was already ancient before they arrived. Stories of the prehistoric dead, placed in stone coffins in the earth. Stories of a Viking-age grave marker shaped like a longhouse for the dead. Stories of bones found beneath the church floor, lying in the darkness while generations worshipped above them. Stories of covenanters and martyrs. Of a man from this parish hanged at Edinburgh's Mercat Cross for his faith. Of old accusations, old fears, old prayers. Of a village that once belonged to a much wider world of river, orchard, coal, estate, kirk, and field. And, in the strangest coda to a long and serious history, a future Prime Minister of Great Britain sitting quietly in the pews of this small Clyde Valley kirk, listening to the bell ring across the meadows. The name itself is worth approaching slowly. Dalserf. It appears gentle enough now, a village name, a word on a sign, something local, modest, easy to say without thinking. But old names are rarely empty. The first part is often understood as coming from the Gaelic dail, a field, a meadow, a flat piece of fertile ground beside water, a place shaped by flooding, a place softened and enriched by the river, a place where the silt settles and the grass grows thick, and the second part carries the memory of serf. Saint Serf, a figure from the early Christian memory of Scotland, a man whose life is difficult to separate from legend, but whose name has clung to this place with extraordinary persistence. Tradition says he came to this valley. Tradition says he preached here. Tradition says the ground took his name. The field of surf. Dalserf. Dalserf. That is the safer reading, the gentler one, the one the village can carry comfortably. But there is another possibility, an older, stranger suggestion proposed by some antiquarian writers who looked at the old forms of the name and heard something else within them. Not serf, sarf. Not the field of the saint, the field of the serpent. It may not be the stronger etymology. It may not be the one a careful historian would choose first, but it is too evocative to ignore. Because Dalserf does feel like a place with two names, one visible, one hidden. One belonging to the saint, the kirk, the bell, the ordered rows of gravestones. The other belonging to something older. The bend of the river, the wet ground, the prehistoric dead. The deep memory of a landscape that was sacred long before Christianity gave it language. The field of the saint, the field of the serpent. Two ways of understanding the same quiet place by the water. Tonight, we will explore both. Chapter 1. The River, Scotland's oldest road. Before Dalserf was a village, it was a bend in the river. Before the church, before the graveyard, before the saints, before the Vikings, before the Covenanters, before the orchards and the roads and the cottages and the names carved into stone, there was water. The Clyde rises far to the south, in the hills near the southern uplands, where small burns gather themselves out of wet ground and begin the long work of becoming a river. At first, it is modest, a stream among rough grass and open hill. Then it grows, collecting water from slopes and tributaries, widening as it moves north and west, finding the shape of the land and being shaped by it in return. By the time it reaches the Clyde Valley, between Lanark and Hamilton, it has become something with authority. Not violent, most of the time, not theatrical, but certain. It knows where it is going. It moves through the valley with the quiet confidence of water that has travelled a long way and will travel further still. It curves around fields. It presses against banks. It deposits silt. It changes the ground slowly, patiently, without needing anyone to notice. And at Dalserf, it bends. That bend matters. A river bend is never only scenery. It is shelter, it is boundary, it is defence, it is food, it is movement, it is danger. It is the difference between a place people pass through and a place people stop. The water wraps around three sides of the church ground, creating a kind of natural enclosure. Stand there and you can feel how the river defines the place. It does not merely pass Dalserf. It holds it. The land sits within the curve of the Clyde like something cupped in a hand. This is why people came. Long before anyone wrote the name Dalserf, long before anyone spoke of saints, long before the present church stood in its graveyard. People came because the river made the place possible. It gave water to drink, fish to catch, soil rich enough to grow food, meadows for grazing, a route through the valley, a crossing to be watched, a boundary to be defended. The Clyde was Scotland's oldest road. Before roads were cut properly through the land, before bridges made crossing simple, Before maps made distance feel manageable, a river was a way of moving through the world. You followed it. You walked beside it. You crossed where it allowed you to cross. You carried goods along it. You learned its moods. You learned where the bank held firm and where it broke underfoot. You learned the difference between summer water and winter water, between safe shallows and the quiet, dark places where the current could take a life without leaving much trace. A river teaches memory to those who live beside it. Families who worked this land would have known the Clyde not as a blue line on a map, but as a presence, something practical and intimate, something that watered their animals and flooded their fields, carried their reflections, swallowed their secrets, and marked the edge of their world. Children would have learned where not to step. Old people would have watched the river in flood and remembered other floods. Farmers would have read the level of the water the way others read a clock. The dead were buried close to it, the living built close to it, the sacred gathered close to it. That is how very old places begin, not with stone, with water. The valley itself is unusually generous. The slopes above the river create shelter. The ground is fertile. The alluvial soil, laid down by winter floods over thousands of years, is rich in a way that harsher upland ground is not. This part of Lanarkshire has a softness to it that can surprise people who only know the colder, bleaker moorland beyond. By the 17th century, and probably earlier in smaller ways, the valley had become known for fruit. Orchards took hold on the slopes. Apple trees, pear trees, plum trees, cherry trees. Later, glasshouses appeared, catching warmth, extending seasons, turning the valley into one of Scotland's great fruit-growing districts. In spring, the Clyde Valley became famous for blossom. White and pink across the slopes. Trees flowering above the river, petals blown across lanes and churchyards. The scent of fruit trees in the air around old graves. There is something deeply moving about that image. The dead in the kirkyard, the river moving below, the trees flowering above them every year. No matter what history had done, no matter the wars, the trials, the hangings, the clearances, the griefs carried privately into the pews of the Auld Grey Mother Kirk, spring still came. The blossoms still opened. The valley still remembered how to become beautiful. But the river's importance goes much deeper than orchards. The Clyde Valley was a route long before it was a garden. In prehistoric times, people moved along it because rivers were natural guides. In the Iron Age, communities settled near it because it offered food, fertility, and visibility. In the Roman period, the valley mattered because control of river routes meant control of movement. Later, in the early medieval period, the Clyde became the spine of a kingdom. Strathclyde, the Valley of the Clyde, one of the last Brittonic-speaking kingdoms of the north. Dalserf belonged to that world, not Glasgow's Clyde, not the Clyde of shipyards and industrial power, an older Clyde, a river of saints and small kingdoms, a river of crossings and fields, a river of wooden boats, cattle tracks, burial mounds, chapels, and watchful bens. The ground around Dalserf carries traces of this long human presence. Local histories speak of ancient remains, early burials, Roman traces in the wider area, old earthworks, and signs that this bend of the river mattered long before the present village took form. We need to be careful. The further back we go, the less certain the story becomes. The evidence grows fragmentary. The ground gives hints rather than full sentences. A stone coffin here, a carved stone there, a mound remembered in an old account, a tradition preserved by people who knew the place before professional archaeology had words for it. But even hints are important, especially in a place like Dalserf. Because Dalserf is not dramatic in the way some historic places are dramatic. It does not give you a ruined castle on a cliff or a battlefield marked by flags. Its history is quieter than that, lower to the ground, more intimate. You have to look down, at the church floor, at the carved stone, at the older shapes under the grass, at the curve of the river. You have to listen, and when you do, the place begins to speak. The river is the voice beneath that speaking. It has seen every layer arrive. The prehistoric dead came first, or at least they came before the records. Then the river farmers. Then the old Brittonic-speaking communities of the valley. Then Rome, briefly and forcefully, with its roads and discipline and habit of measuring the world. Then the saints. Then the Viking-age dead, leaving behind a stone shaped like a house. Then medieval lords and kirkmen. Then covenanters. Then orchard growers. Then miners and estate workers and ministers and schoolchildren and visitors who arrived by car and stood in the churchyard, not quite knowing what they were standing in. And through all of it, the Clyde, moving in the dark, moving under moonlight, moving in winter flood, moving past blossom in spring, moving past funerals, weddings, baptisms, sermons, silence. The river has no need to remember in the way we remember. It does not keep dates. It does not preserve names. It does not distinguish between saint and soldier, martyr and minister, villager and visitor. But it keeps the shape of things. It keeps the bend. It keeps the silt. It keeps the low sound that has always been there beneath the human story. And that is why Dalserf feels the way it does. Not haunted exactly, not in the obvious sense, but held. Held by water. Held by memory. Held by the strange, patient gravity of a place where too much has happened for the village to be as small as it looks. So before we speak of saints, or serpents, or Viking stones, or bones beneath the floor, we must begin here, with the river. The oldest road, the first witness, the thing that carried the valley into history and will, long after the last name in the kirkyard has weathered smooth, carry it quietly onward into the dark. Chapter 2. Before the Saints. The deep dark of the valley. Before the saints came, before the church bell, before the kirk walls and the rows of gravestones, before anyone called this place Dalserf, there were people living and dying beside the Clyde. They did not leave us written records. They did not leave parish registers, title deeds, minutes of kirk sessions, or carved dates above doorways. They left what the ground allowed them to leave: stone, bone, earthworks, burials, a change in the colour of the soil where a post once stood, a mound that looked natural until someone opened it and found the human dead inside. That is how the oldest human story of Dalserf speaks, not in sentences, in traces. The evidence suggests very early human presence around this bend of the Clyde, though the exact continuity of settlement is harder to prove. That is the honest sentence. But honesty does not make the story less powerful. If anything, it makes it more so. Because the fragments we do have point towards a truth that can be felt, even where it cannot be fully reconstructed. This was good ground, rich ground, sheltered ground, ground near water, ground in a bend of a river where movement could be watched, where animals could be grazed, where the living could work and the dead could be placed with care. The people who first used this place would have understood the river differently from us. To them it was not a view, not a pleasant sound, not a picturesque setting for a churchyard. It was survival. It was risk. It was weather made liquid. It was a route by which strangers could come and a boundary that might, on the right day, keep them away. The valley was not empty before Christianity. It was not waiting passively for saints to arrive and give it meaning. It already had meaning. There is a story from the local records that stays with me. At some point in the improving centuries, perhaps the 18th century, perhaps the early 19th, when roads were being cut and straightened and the old landscape was being made more useful to modern eyes, workmen came upon a mound, an earthen mound, artificial, or at least old enough and shaped enough to draw attention, the kind of thing that had sat in the landscape for so long that people may no longer have known exactly what it was, only that it was not ordinary. At first, stones from the mound were used for road building. That was not unusual. Old structures often became quarries for new ones. Ancient walls became field dikes. Religious houses became farm buildings. Burial stones were turned into steps. The past, in practical communities, was often treated as a store of materials. And then the workmen found something inside. Stone coffins, cist burials. Small stone-lined graves of the kind used in prehistoric Scotland, containing human remains laid down long before any church stood in the valley. The road building stopped. Not perhaps for the reasons it would stop today, not because of formal archaeology, protected status, survey reports, or heritage policy, but because the older instincts of the community stirred. A storm came on. That is what the account says. A sudden, terrible storm, arriving as the mound was disturbed, fierce enough and strange enough for people to link the weather to the dead. The mound had been opened. The old ones had been troubled. The sky answered. A careful modern mind knows what to say here. Weather changes. Storms arrive. Coincidence attaches itself to memory. A community finds meaning where perhaps there was only timing. All of that may be true, but it is not the whole truth. Because the reaction of the people tells us something important about how they understood the ground beneath them. They recognized the mound as more than earth. They recognized the dead as more than discarded remains. They understood instinctively that some places should not be disturbed casually. That is a form of knowledge. Not scientific knowledge, not archaeological knowledge. Something older. Reverence. Fear. The sense that the dead retain a claim on the place where they were laid. In a valley as old as this one, that instinct would not have been foolish. The ground beneath Dalserf and around Dalserf is layered with use. A field may have been a field for centuries, but before that it may have been a settlement. Before that, a burial place. Before that, a place where animals were driven to water or where people gathered at a crossing. The surface of a landscape is always late, always the most recent version. The deeper story is underneath. Before the saints, there were the Brittonic-speaking peoples of the Clyde Valley, communities related in language and culture to the peoples whose descendants would speak Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. Roman writers would give broad names to the tribes and peoples of this region, but those names were made from outside. The people themselves had their own names, their own kin groups, their own memories, their own understandings of river and hill and field. They farmed the valley. They kept cattle. They moved with seasons. They built in timber and thatch, materials that return quickly to the earth and leave only hints behind. They would have had their own sacred places, their own stories of the river, their own names for the bend where Dalserf now sits. We do not know those names, but the loss of the name is not the same as the absence of the people. They were here. They watched winter water rise in the Clyde. They saw mist lift from the river in the morning. They buried their dead in stone-lined graves and mounds and trusted that the living would leave them in peace. And perhaps already this field had a reputation. Perhaps the bend in the river was already understood as a place set apart, a place where the land made a shape that felt meaningful, a place where water enclosed the living and kept the dead near. Later Christianity often settled on older sacred places, not always by accident and not always by force. Sometimes because the missionaries themselves sensed what the local people already knew, that certain places had weight, that worship belonged more naturally in some places than in others, that if you wished to speak of heaven to people who lived close to the earth, you began where the earth already seemed to listen. Dalserf may be such a place where the sacred did not arrive all at once, but changed its language. Think of the layers, the prehistoric mound, the stone coffins, the river farmers, the old Brittonic names now lost, the Roman traces, the saint's field, the Viking-age stone, the medieval burials, the Presbyterian kirk, the bones beneath the floor. Each age did not erase the last. It covered it, the way silt covers a riverbed, the way grass covers a wall line, the way a floor covers the earth beneath it, until one day the boards are lifted and the older story looks back. This is why Dalserf feels so dense. The village is small because the present is small. The past is not. The past spreads below it, around it, through it, like roots under a tree. And beneath those roots, water. Always water. The Clyde moving past in the dark, keeping time for the dead. Chapter 3. The Field of Serf, the Field of the Serpent. At some point, the saints came to the Clyde Valley, not into emptiness, not into a blank landscape awaiting meaning. They came into a valley already alive with memory, burial, river work, old language, older fear, and the deep practical wisdom of people who knew their land intimately. Christianity did not arrive in Scotland as a single, clean event. It moved through persons, through journeys, through preaching, teaching, patronage, settlement, conflict, adaptation, and stories told later by people trying to make sense of beginnings that had already become distant. One of the names attached to Dalserf is Serf, Saint Serf. He is not an easy figure to hold with certainty. His life belongs to the early Christian memory of Scotland, and like many saints of that period, his history and legend have become difficult to separate. The sources are late, the details shift, places claim him, stories gather around him. Holiness, once remembered by communities, rarely remains tidy for historians. But uncertainty does not make him meaningless. It makes him human. Serf belongs to that misty, formative age of Scottish Christianity, when the faith moved through river valleys, royal courts, monastic settlements, and small communities whose names are now mostly lost. He is most strongly associated with Culross in Fife, but tradition also draws him westward, into the Clyde Valley, into the world of the Brittonic-speaking kingdom that would become known as Strathclyde. And here, at Dalserf, the tradition says his name took root, the Field of Serf. A water meadow beside the Clyde, a fertile place, a place already old, a place where a chapel may have stood long before the present kirk, and where Christian worship may have continued, in one form or another, for well over 1,000 years. Imagine him, if you can, not as a stained glass saint, not as an icon detached from weather and mud, but as a man moving through a real valley, the Clyde beside him, wet grass underfoot, smoke from hearths rising from small settlements, people watching from doorways, a language in the air that is not ours, a world balanced between old belief and new proclamation. To preach in such a place was not simply to deliver ideas. It was to enter a landscape and ask to be heard by people whose gods, ancestors, fears and loyalties were already embedded in it. A missionary in early Scotland had to understand this, whether consciously or not. Faith had to become local. It had to attach itself to water, hill, field, well, burial ground, and memory. It had to be spoken in the language of people who needed not abstraction, but blessing. Blessing over birth, blessing over cattle, blessing over illness, blessing over death, blessing over the dangerous crossing from this world into whatever waited beyond it. So perhaps Serf stood here and spoke. Perhaps he prayed beside the river. Perhaps he blessed the water. Perhaps a small chapel was raised where people already felt the ground to be different. We cannot prove the scene, but we can understand why it endured. The most resonant part of Serf's tradition is his connection to Mungo, also known as Kentigern, the patron saint of Glasgow. Mungo is one of the great names of early Scottish Christianity. His memory is woven into the identity of Glasgow itself, into the city's motto, into the idea that a settlement on the Clyde could become a place of preaching, learning, trade, suffering, invention, and astonishing growth. Tradition says that Serf was Mungo's teacher, that the older saint raised or educated the younger one, that the faith carried through Serf passed into Mungo, and through Mungo into the city that would rise downstream. If that tradition touches Dalserf even indirectly, then this small water meadow becomes part of a much larger story. The quiet bend in the river becomes connected to Glasgow's beginning. The village the world forgets becomes part of the spiritual ancestry of a city the world knows. That is one of Dalserf's strange gifts. The place is small, but its connections are wide. You think you are standing in a village graveyard, then a name opens. Serf, Mungo, Glasgow, Strathclyde, the river. Suddenly the small place is no longer small. But the Saints' Field is not the only reading. As we said at the beginning, some older writers heard another possibility in the name. Sarf, serpent, the field of the serpent. We should not treat this as the safer history. It is not. The association with serf is stronger, more natural, more rooted in the Christian memory of the place. But the serpent reading has its own power, precisely because it feels like something from underneath. The serpent is an old image, older than any one religion. It appears in stories of wisdom, danger, earth, healing, temptation, fertility, death, renewal, and hidden knowledge. A creature that moves close to the ground, disappearing into holes and returning from them, shedding its skin, seeming to die and be remade. In a river meadow, in a place of wet ground and old burials, the serpent image is not difficult to understand. The river itself has something serpentine about it. It bends, it coils, it slides through the valley with quiet strength. It shines in the dark when moonlight touches it. It disappears behind trees and returns again, never still, never finished. The serpent's field may not be the correct etymology, but it is a true image. Perhaps that is enough for a night narration. Not every old story has to be fact in order to reveal something. Sometimes an image survives because it gives shape to a feeling that the safer explanation cannot fully hold. Dalserf is the field of serf. Let us keep that. It honours the saint, the chapel, the kirk, the long Christian memory of the valley. But somewhere beneath that, in the darker water, in the prehistoric mound, in the stone coffins, in the bones below the floor, the serpent still moves. Not as a monster, not as a threat, as the older name of unease. The reminder that every sacred place has roots deeper than its official story. The Saints' Field, the Serpent's Field, both held by the river. Chapter 4. The Kingdom Beneath the Orchards. To understand Dalserf, you have to understand that it once belonged to a kingdom most people now barely remember. Not Scotland, not in the form we mean when we use that word today. Before the Kingdom of Scotland took its later shape, before Gaelic, Scots, English and modern identity settled across the map in ways we recognise, the Clyde Valley belonged to the Brittonic kingdom of Strathclyde. Strathclyde, the Valley of the Clyde, a name that still sounds geographic, almost neutral, but once meant power, territory, language, kingship. A people who understood themselves not as a footnote to later Scotland, but as a world of their own. Their great centre was Auld Clut, the rock of the Clyde, the volcanic fortress at Dumbarton, rising dramatically where the River Leven meets the Clyde. From that rock, kings ruled a region that stretched through river valleys, upland margins, settlements, farms, churches and strong places. Dalserf lay within that world, upstream in the green body of the valley, part of the landscape through which messages, travellers, cattle, saints and soldiers moved. The people of Strathclyde spoke Cumbric, a Brittonic language related to Welsh, Cornish and Breton. It has vanished now, leaving only traces in place names and in the patient work of scholars who reconstruct lost sounds from surviving fragments. But for centuries, it was the language of this valley. The language of bargaining, prayer, gossip, grief. The language in which parents called children home from the riverbank. The language in which the earliest Christians of the valley may first have spoken of God. This is important because we tend to flatten the past. We make Scotland old, and that is true enough. But within that oldness were many older worlds. Strathclyde was one of them. A kingdom with its own memory, its own dynasties, its own saints, its own vulnerabilities. It survived pressure from Picts, Angles, Vikings, Scots and others. It endured raids and shifting alliances. It watched the balance of Britain change around it and kept existing for centuries longer than a simpler story would allow. Dalserf, in that period, would not have been a village in the modern sense. There may have been settlement near the Bend, a chapel, a sacred site, farmed land, a crossing, a cluster of people whose lives were tied to the river and to a wider kingdom whose capital lay downstream. The details are uncertain. The world is real. The Clyde connected it all. Dumbarton Rock and Dalserf, Glasgow's early Christian settlement and the orchards that would come much later. The saints and the farmers. The royal centre and the quiet field. The river was not background to Strathclyde. It was the spine. Later Welsh tradition remembers this northern Brittonic world in stories of Ruthuch, Myrddin, and the broken prophet in the woods. Myrddin, the early shadow behind what would later become Merlin. Before the familiar wizard of later Arthurian romance, before the pointed hat and the comfortable storybook magic, there was a darker figure, a warrior, poet and prophet who, in legend, lost his mind after battle and fled into the wild woods of the north. His story belongs not to a clean fantasy realm, but to the fractured borderlands of early medieval Britain, where kingdoms rose and fell in mist, where battle and prophecy sat closer together than modern minds expect. Whether these traditions preserve history, poetry, or both, they remind us that Strathclyde was not empty country waiting to be absorbed. It was imaginative country, a kingdom with songs, with courts, with grief, with saints, with warriors, with languages now gone from daily speech, but not entirely gone from the land. The orchards came later, much later. But I like the phrase, the kingdom beneath the orchards, because when you stand in the Clyde Valley and see trees, fields, cottages, glass houses, church walls and quiet roads, you are seeing the latest surface. Beneath that surface lies Strathclyde. Beneath Strathclyde, older river communities. Beneath them, the prehistoric dead. Layer after layer, each one mostly invisible unless you know it is there. A plum tree can grow above the lost language of a kingdom. A churchyard can sit above a Viking-age stone. A road can pass over a burial mound. A village of fewer than 100 people can rest on ground once connected to kings. This is what Dalserf teaches, if you let it. Smallness is deceptive. A place can look quiet because it has learned to carry its weight without display. By the 11th century, the independent kingdom of Strathclyde had faded into the expanding kingdom of Scotland. Its language declined. Its political structures were absorbed. Its kings became history, then legend, then footnotes, then names argued over by specialists. But the valley did not disappear. The river did not change its course because men changed titles. The people who farmed the land still needed water, shelter, crossings, burial places, faith. The dead were still buried. The saints were still remembered. The old names continued in altered forms. The ground remained valuable because it had always been valuable. And Dalserf remained what it had been from the beginning. A place held in a bend of the Clyde, a place where history passed quietly from one form into another, a place where the river kept moving, as if kingdoms were only one more thing to be carried downstream. Chapter 5. The Viking Stone. A longhouse for the dead. In the churchyard at Dalserf, outside the south wall of the kirk, there is a stone that does not look like the others. It does not stand upright like the later gravestones. It does not announce a name, a date, a family, a verse, a grief shaped into formal inscription. It lies low, long-backed, curved, weathered, quiet. A stone shaped in miniature like the roof of a house. This is the Dalserf hogback stone. Recognised in the late 19th century after having lain in or near the churchyard for longer than anyone living could have understood, it belongs to one of the strangest and most evocative classes of early medieval burial monument in Britain. Hogback stones are usually associated with the Anglo-Scandinavian world of the 10th and 11th centuries. They appear most famously in northern England and parts of Scotland, in places shaped by Viking settlement, Norse influence, Christian adaptation, and the complicated mingling of peoples after the great movements of the Viking-age. They are grave markers, but not like later grave markers. They are not simply stones with names. They are houses for the dead. Look at the shape. The back rises and curves like a roof ridge. The sides fall away like the slopes of a longhouse. On some hogbacks, carved patterns resemble roof tiles or wooden shingles. Some have beasts at their ends, gripping or guarding the stone. They seem to preserve in stone the memory of timber halls, the warm, smoky, crowded places where people ate and slept and told stories through the long dark of northern winters. To place such a stone over the dead was to give them a house, not metaphorically only, visually, physically, in the form of the monument itself, a home shape for the grave. There is something profoundly human in that. A cross speaks of salvation. A name speaks of identity. A date speaks of time. But a house shape speaks of shelter. Whoever commissioned or carved or placed the Dalserf hogback understood death through the image of home. The dead were not simply gone. They were housed, covered, kept, given a roof in stone beside the river. Who lies beneath it? We do not know. That is one of its powers. No name survives to domesticate the mystery. No family line claims it clearly. No neat story tells us exactly whose body, whose grief, whose faith, whose mixture of Christian hope and Scandinavian memory brought that stone to this churchyard. It may have marked the burial of someone wealthy or significant, because such a stone was not an ordinary marker for an ordinary grave. It may have belonged to a family shaped by Viking-age contact, settlement, marriage, trade, or identity. It may have been made by hands that understood both the language of Christian burial and the memory of a northern hall. Later medieval families would hold and reshape this valley, the Cummins, the Hamiltons, the great estates and their houses. But the hogback is older than that later feudal world. It belongs to a stranger borderland, Christian, Scandinavian, local, and not easily named. That is perhaps why it feels so appropriate at Dalserf. The village itself is not easily named either. Saint or serpent, Clyde or Kirk, orchard or coalfield, small village or ancient sacred place. Dalserf refuses to be only one thing. So does the stone. Imagine the day it was placed. Not the day it was rediscovered or recognised by scholars, but the original day. A burial beside the river. The early church or chapel or sacred enclosure nearby. People gathered in clothing and speech now lost to us. Perhaps a priest. Perhaps family members. Perhaps a craftsman standing back from the work, watching the stones settle over the grave. The Clyde moving past. The air cold, perhaps, or bright with early spring, or wet with the kind of Lanarkshire rain that makes every stone darker and every sound closer. A body lowered, a stone placed, a house for the dead. Then the years began to pass, decades, centuries, reformations, wars, new churches, new graves, new languages, new families, new ministers, new buildings. The road outside changing, the valley changing. The orchards growing, flourishing, declining. The coalfield waking and sleeping again. And the stone remained, low to the earth, holding its silence. There is a particular kind of awe that comes from standing near an object older than almost everything visible around it. The kirk is old, but the stone is older. Many gravestones in the churchyard are old, but the hogback is older. Some names in the parish records go back centuries, but the stone is older than those records too. It is older than the Reformation, older than the Covenanters, older than Wallace and Bruce, older than the Scotland that would later claim those men as national figures. It sits there quietly while visitors come and go and asks nothing from them except attention. Perhaps that is what the dead ask most often. Not explanation. Attention. Stand here. Look properly. Know that I was. And if the name is gone, the stone says it anyway. Someone was here. Someone was loved, feared, honoured, remembered, or all of those things at once. Someone was given a house of stone beside the Clyde, and the river has kept moving past them ever since. Chapter 6. The Bones Beneath the Floor. In 1894, Dalserf Parish Church underwent renovation. It was not unusual. Old churches need care. Roofs fail, floors weaken, walls require attention. Congregations alter interiors to suit the needs of the age. A living church is never entirely finished. It is always being repaired, adjusted, renewed, and argued over. At Dalserf, the wooden flooring was removed. Beneath it, earth was dug out, prior to the laying of a concrete floor. And in that earth, they found bones. A great number of human bones and skulls, according to the account preserved by the church's history. Not one accidental fragment, not a single disturbed grave, not a handful of remains scattered by the shifting of soil. A great number. Human bones beneath the floor. Think about what that means. For generations, the congregation had worshipped above them. Children had been baptized above them. Couples married above them. Coffins carried in and prayed over above them. Sermons preached, psalms sung, elders seated, ministers ordained or buried, ordinary Sundays passing in their long, quiet procession. And beneath the feet of the living, the dead of another age lay in the dark. No one in the pews knew their names. Perhaps no one knew they were there at all. The present church building at Dalserf carries the memory of 1655 in its local tradition and fabric, while later repairs and renovations shaped the building we see now. Historic accounts speak of older sacred structures on the site, and the hogback stone alone suggest that Christian burial and commemoration here predate the visible kirk by many centuries. So the bones under the floor were not an impossibility. They were a revelation. They told the congregation what very old churches often know and modern people forget, that sacred ground is rarely empty ground. Burial inside a church was never ordinary in the way churchyard burial was ordinary. In the medieval period, to be buried within the walls of a church was a privilege. It might speak of status, patronage, wealth, office, holiness, or the desire to rest as close as possible to the altar, the prayers, the Eucharist, the living voice of the church. The poor and ordinary dead lay outside. The important dead, the blessed dead, or those whose families had the means, might lie within. But centuries alter buildings. A chapel is replaced. A kirk is rebuilt. Floors rise. Floors are laid over older earth. Burials are forgotten. Stones are moved. Names vanish. The living continue because the living must continue, and the dead remain below. There is no suggestion here of anything theatrical. No curse. No ghost appearing at the moment of discovery. No melodrama. Only bones, which is enough. Bones are the most serious thing the past can leave. They cannot be treated as metaphor for long. They return the story to the body, to hunger, age, illness, injury, labour, childbirth, fever, breath, and the last silence after breath stops. Who were they? A medieval laird and his family? Priests or early ministers? Benefactors of an older chapel? People buried near a pre-Reformation altar? Members of a local family whose name once mattered greatly and now means nothing to anyone beyond a line in a damaged record? We do not know. And perhaps the not knowing is the point. The bones belonged to people who once thought themselves central to their own lives, as we all do. They knew their own names. They had faces others recognized. They were expected at tables. They were missed when absent. They were mourned when they died. Then time did what time does. It thinned the memory. It erased the pronunciation of names. It weathered stones. It changed the language. It replaced buildings. It laid floorboards over the old earth and allowed the living to forget what they were standing above. Until the day in 1894 when the boards came up, and the past looked back through skulls. The bones were removed. The work continued. The concrete floor was laid. The church returned to use. That, too, is part of the story. The living have to keep building over the dead. They have to. Every old village, every old city, every old church, every road and field and farm rests on people who came before. To live anywhere with history is to be late to a conversation that began long before you arrived. But some places make that lateness harder to ignore. Dalserf is one of them. The bones beneath the floor are not simply an eerie detail. They are the key to the whole place. They tell you that the visible church is only the surface. They tell you that worship here did not begin with the pews you can see, or the walls as they stand now, or the names in the modern register. It began deeper, earlier, in a ground that had already been sacred for a very long time. They tell you that the dead of Dalserf are not outside the story. They are under it, literally. There is an image I cannot quite leave alone. A winter Sunday, some time before the renovation. The congregation gathered, coats damp from rain, the river high outside, the minister's voice rising and falling, a child shifting restlessly in a pew, an old woman lowering her head during prayer, the sound of a hymn filling the small stone building. And beneath them, 2 feet down, bones, silent, anonymous, patient, not threatening the living, simply sharing the space. This is what an old kirk is. Not just walls and pulpit and bell, not just a place where people go to worship, a layered house of the living and the dead, a place where time sits vertically, the living above, the dead below, and outside, the river moving past them both. Chapter 7. Wallace in the Valley, the Guardian in hiding. In the years of Scotland's first war of independence, the Clyde Valley belonged to danger. Roads were watched, castles mattered. Loyalties could save or destroy a family. A man could be sheltered in one house and betrayed in another. A name spoken too loudly could bring soldiers to a door. And through this dangerous valley, tradition says, William Wallace moved. Wallace is one of those figures who almost disappears under the weight of what later generations needed him to be. Patriot, giant, outlaw, martyr, guardian, legend. The historical man is real enough, but the stories around him are thick, passionate, contradictory, and often impossible to separate cleanly from memory and myth. That does not make them disposable. It means they have to be handled with care. Local tradition places Wallace in the Clyde Valley in the years after the killing of the English Sheriff of Lanark, William Heselrigg, an event that itself became bound to the story of Wallace's wife and personal grief. Whether every detail can be proven or not, the broader idea makes sense. A fugitive fighter needed landscape. He needed cover. He needed sympathetic people. He needed routes of movement not obvious to outsiders. He needed valleys, woods, river crossings, barns, orchards, chapels, and households willing to risk everything by keeping quiet. The Clyde Valley could give him that. Think of Dalserf not as a postcard village, but as cover. The river bending around the land, the steep places along the banks, the orchards that would later become famous in more peaceful ways, the scattered farms, the old paths, the water itself, which could be crossed by those who knew where and when, and could delay those who did not. Landscape is not passive in a war of resistance. It hides people or exposes them. It slows horses. It conceals movement. It gives warning. It punishes arrogance. It rewards local knowledge. To a man like Wallace, hunted and moving, the Clyde Valley was not scenery. It was possibility. Dalserf's own historical tradition preserves a connection between Wallace and the parish, and just across the river, at Maudsley, another tradition carries even greater weight. There, it is said, Wallace was made guardian of Scotland. Not in a royal palace, not in a cathedral of national ceremony, but at Forest Kirk, in this valley, near the river, on ground that had already known saints and burials and old power. We must say it carefully. Local tradition says, the older story remembers. If true, it is extraordinary. If not literally true in every detail, it is still revealing, because it tells us what the valley believed itself to have held. Guardian of Scotland. There is a weight in that title. A guardian is not merely a commander, not merely a soldier. A guardian carries something vulnerable on behalf of someone absent. In Wallace's case, he carried the realm in the name of a king who was no longer free. He stood, for a time, between Scotland and Erasure. To imagine that title bestowed beside the Clyde is to imagine the river witnessing one of the great transformations of Scottish history. The outlaw becoming the guardian, the fugitive becoming the office-bearer, the hunted man becoming the symbol of a kingdom's refusal to disappear. Perhaps it happened exactly as tradition says. Perhaps memory has moved the scene into a valley that cherished Wallace's name. Either way, the story belongs here now. It has become part of the place. After Wallace's execution in London in 1305, his body was divided and displayed as a warning. The English state intended his death to speak. It did, but not in the way intended. A warning can become a seed. A body displayed in pieces can become a nation remembering itself. A man killed as a traitor can become, over centuries, the image of loyalty itself. The Clyde Valley kept its Wallace stories because communities keep the stories that help them understand who they are. And Dalserf, small as it is, sits within that keeping. The same river that moved past the saints moved past the age of Wallace. The same bend that held the church ground held the memory of danger, hiding, allegiance, and risk. The same road that now carries ordinary traffic once belonged to a landscape where the wrong rider appearing at the wrong time could mean capture or death. It is easy to make history too grand. Banners, crowns, battle speeches, monumental names. But the survival of resistance often depends on quieter things. A door opened after dark, a horse hidden, food left in a place only one man knew to look, a warning carried before soldiers arrived, a boat ready at a crossing, a community deciding, silently, that it will not betray. That is the kind of history a river valley can hold, not only the great names, the unnamed hands that kept them alive. Robert Bruce, too, had connections to this valley. Maudsley and Dalserf appear in the story of lands, grants, mills, and power after the wars had entered a different phase. The river valley that had sheltered and remembered resistance also became part of the settlement that followed. War turns eventually into charters. Hiding places become estates. Dangerous ground becomes property. But the river does not care for paperwork. It watched Wallace's tradition pass into Bruce's struggle into victory, victory into landholding, landholding into parish life into stone and record and memory. Everything changes form. The river carries the form away. But something remains in the bend. Something of the man in hiding. Something of the guardian. Something of the valley that knew when to keep quiet. Chapter 8. The Auld Grey Mother Kirk. The church at Dalserf is not grand. That is part of its power. It does not attempt to overwhelm you. It does not rise with cathedral ambition. It does not announce itself as one of the great ecclesiastical buildings of Scotland. It sits, grey, compact, weathered, steady. A kirk beside a river, surrounded by its dead. Dalserf remembers 1655. A stone on the southern wall bears the date, and local church tradition treats it as the year the kirk was raised. Official descriptions and later building history speak of repairs, alterations, and the shaping of the present structure through later work. Either way, the truth that matters for this story is clear. This is an old Presbyterian kirk, rooted in the Covenanting age, built on older sacred ground, and still standing in the bend of the Clyde. It is not the first place of worship here. It is the visible descendant of many places of worship. That distinction matters. It is not the first place of worship here. It is the visible descendant of many places of worship. That distinction matters. A church like Dalserf is never just one building. It is a continuation, an argument across centuries between what is rebuilt, what is retained, what is forgotten, and what refuses to disappear. The church acquired a name, or perhaps a kind of affection shaped into a name. The Auld Grey Mother Kirk. There is tenderness in that phrase. Old, grey, mother. Not palace, not fortress, not monument. Mother. A building that holds, a building that receives people when they are newly born, when they marry, when they bury their dead, when they come seeking comfort, order, forgiveness, or simply a familiar place to sit in silence. The grey matters too. Scottish churches are often grey, not because they lack beauty, but because their beauty belongs to weather. Rain deepens them. Low light suits them. Moss and lichen soften them. They belong not to clean perfection, but to endurance. The Auld Grey Mother Kirk has endured. Through religious conflict, through political upheaval, through the Covenanting years, when worship could be loyalty or rebellion, depending on who was watching. Through the rise and fall of local estates. Through orchard seasons, coal years, wars, deaths, weddings, ministers coming and going, children growing old, and old names disappearing from common speech. It has stood while the river moved. The interior matters because Presbyterian churches are built around hearing. The word preached, the psalm sung. The congregation gathered not around visual spectacle, but around listening. A tea-plan or preaching-focused arrangement was not accidental. It shaped the community into an audience for the spoken word. In a night narration, that feels important. Dalserf itself is a place that must be heard. The river, the bell, the minister's voice, the scrape of shoes on stone, the hush before prayer, the faint shifting of people in pews, the rain against old glass, the sound of a coffin being carried. These sounds make the building real, not as architecture only, as a vessel for human attention. Local tradition points to the church's many exits and reads them through the memory of dangerous times, when worship itself could make a congregation vulnerable. Whether every detail of that tradition can be tied to a specific incident is less important than what the tradition reveals. People remembered the church not simply as shelter from weather, but as a place from which one might one day need to flee. That is a hard thing to imagine now. A church service interrupted by fear. A congregation listening not only to the sermon, but for hoofbeats. Doors not as conveniences, but as possibilities of escape. This is the context in which the Covenanter story of Dalserf must be understood. Faith was not private in the comfortable modern sense. It was public, political, dangerous. To pray in one way rather than another could mark you. To attend the wrong meeting, refuse the wrong oath, shelter the wrong preacher, or speak the wrong opinion could bring fines, imprisonment, exile, or death. And still people came. They came to church, they gathered in fields, they listened to preachers in the open air. They carried Bibles, weapons, fear, and conviction. They understood that the line between worship and resistance had become almost impossible to draw. The Auld Grey Mother Kirk belongs to that world, not as a museum piece, but as a survivor. It has absorbed prayers that were whispered because they were dangerous. It has absorbed the grief of families who lost people to the killing times. It has absorbed the quieter sufferings that never made it into any official list. The worry of women whose husbands had gone to conventicles, the fear of children hearing soldiers spoken of in low voices, the pressure of neighbours watching neighbours. A Mother Kirk holds more than hymns. It holds what people cannot otherwise carry. The stained glass, the bell, the worn paths through the churchyard, the familiar shape of the building against the sky, all of these are part of Dalserf's emotional memory. So is the fact that it is still in use. That matters. A ruined church speaks one kind of history. A living church speaks another. In a ruin, the past is sealed. In a living kirk, the past has to make room for the next Sunday. People still gather where the bones were found. People still walk past the hogback stone. They still stand among the graves. They still hear the river, whether consciously or not, moving beyond the churchyard wall. The Auld Grey Mother Kirk is not finished with its work. It is still holding the village, small as the village is, quiet as the road may be. The mother still keeps watch. Chapter 9. Arthur Bruce of Skellyton, hanged at the Mercat Cross. On the 30th of November, 1683, a man from Dalserf was hanged at the Mercat Cross of Edinburgh. His name was Arthur Bruce. He came from Skellyton within the parish of Dalserf. Not a national figure in the way Wallace or Bruce or Churchill became national figures. Not a man whose name is widely known outside the history of the Covenanters and the local memory of this valley. But he was a man who lived, a man who belonged somewhere, a man who had a home, a parish, neighbours, opinions, fears, perhaps family, perhaps friends who later spoke of him in low voices because even memory could be dangerous. He was a Covenanter. That word can become too easy if we let it. We can say it as if it names only a historical category, a group in a textbook. But to be a Covenanter in late 17th century Scotland was to be marked by a conflict between conscience and state power. It meant believing that Christ, not the king, was head of the church. It meant resisting the imposed structures of episcopacy. It meant, in certain years and circumstances, that your worship could be treated as rebellion. Arthur Bruce was charged with having been at Drumclog, Bothwell, and Rutherglen. Those names were not neutral. Drumclog meant armed covenanting victory over government dragoons in 1679. Bothwell meant the later defeat of the covenanting army. Rutherglen meant open public defiance, the burning of acts against the covenant. To be associated with those places was to be associated with resistance. He was also charged with changing his name and spreading disloyal opinions. The only evidence against him, local church history records, was his own confession. His own confession. We do not know how that confession was obtained. We do know enough about the legal and political world of the period to be cautious about the word. Confession could be produced by fear, pressure, imprisonment, exhaustion, threat, or worse. It could emerge in a system where power already knew what it wanted the accused to be. On the basis of that confession, Arthur Bruce and 2 others were condemned. They were taken to Edinburgh, to the Mercat Cross. And there, on St. Andrew's Day, they were hanged. The Mercat Cross was not merely a place of execution, it was a stage. A public place at the heart of civic life, where proclamations were made, punishments displayed, authority performed. To die there was to be turned into a message. The state did not simply kill men like Arthur Bruce in private. It killed them where people could see, so that the body might instruct the crowd. Here is what happens to disloyalty. Here is what happens to defiance. Here is what happens when conscience refuses to bend. Imagine the distance from Dalserf to Edinburgh in that age. Not simply miles, distance of world, distance of belonging. From a small parish in the Clyde Valley to the stone public space of the capital. From the sound of the river to the sound of a crowd. From the remembered fields of home to the hard machinery of punishment. Did Arthur Bruce think of the Clyde on his last morning? Did he think of Skellyton, of the roads and fields he knew, of the Kirk, of the people who would hear later that he had died? We cannot know, but it is hard not to imagine it. He was not alone in the suffering of this parish. Dalserf's church history records dozens of men and women from the parish who suffered in one way or another for the covenanting cause. Some were fined, some imprisoned, some transported, some killed. The churchyard memorial remembers those who died in the years of persecution, their testimony carved into stone so that the village would not forget. That memorial matters, because the state often counts bodies differently from communities. The state records charges, verdicts, punishments. A community remembers absence. The empty place at a table. The field worked by someone else, the woman left to manage after the arrest. The children who grew up knowing their father's name carried danger. The road watched more anxiously after soldiers passed. The kirk entered with more care. The psalm sung with more weight because it had cost someone everything. There is another Covenanter figure buried at Dalserf, the Reverend John Macmillan. His story belongs to a later stage of the Covenanting tradition, after the worst of the killing times had passed, but the arguments over settlement, conscience, and the purity of the church had not entirely ended. Macmillan was a passionate, uncompromising preacher, a man who would not settle easily into arrangements he believed incomplete. In his later years, he came to Dalserf, and there he died in 1753. An obelisk marks his grave. It is fitting that he rests here. Dalserf had already become the kind of place that could absorb a firebrand into quietness without extinguishing what he had stood for. The River Valley does not shout. It does not need to. It keeps testimony in softer ways, a grave, a memorial, a date, a name, a story repeated because forgetting would be a second death. Arthur Bruce did not return alive from Edinburgh, but his name came back. It came back to the parish, to the church history, to the memory of the place, to the stones among the dead, to a night narration centuries later spoken beside the river that ran near his home. That is not justice. Justice would have been for him not to hang. But memory is something. Memory is the one small answer the living can give to power after power has done its worst. The river at Dalserf has carried many things: rainwater, silt, blossom petals, reflections of clouds, the sound of bells, the shadows of people walking the churchyard path. It also carries names. Arthur Bruce of Skellyton, hanged at the Market Cross, returned to the village by memory, kept, like everything else here, by the river. Chapter 10. Coal, Blossom, and the Village That Grew Quiet. Dalserf did not become quiet all at once. Quietness came slowly. It came as roads changed, as work changed, as estates rose and altered, as mines opened and closed, as orchards flourished and declined, as families moved towards towns, factories, pits, schools, opportunities, losses, and elsewhere. Old villages rarely disappear in a single dramatic moment. They recede, one household at a time, one trade at a time, one farm absorbed into another, one shop closed, one school changed, One generation choosing not to return because life has pulled them downriver. Dalserf today feels almost untouched in places, but that feeling is deceptive. The village and parish have passed through enormous change. The quiet you feel now is not the absence of history. It is what history leaves behind after the noise has moved on. Above ground, blossom. Below ground, coal. That is one way to understand the wider Clyde Valley and Dalserf parish in the modern period. The orchards gave the valley one identity: spring beauty, fruit picking, glass houses, trees stepping up the slopes above the river. A softer story, though anyone who worked the land would know it was never truly soft. Fruit growing is labour. Pruning, grafting, picking, packing, carrying, hoping the weather will not undo a season's work in an hour. Beauty does not mean ease. But the blossom mattered. It brought visitors. It gave a valley a reputation. It made the river slopes famous in April and May, when white and pink flowers opened against the Scottish grey and made the place look briefly enchanted. Then there was coal, a darker inheritance, a harder one. The wider parish landscape stood over mineral wealth, and like so many parts of Lanarkshire, it was drawn into the industrial story of Scotland. Pits, workers, rows, movement, danger, wages, strikes, injury, dust, endurance. The underground world altered the above-ground one. Men went down into darkness beneath land where fruit trees blossomed. There is a strange symmetry in that. Above, petals; below, coal seams. Above, the scent of spring; below, the black, compressed memory of ancient forests. Both were forms of time. Both shaped the lives of the people who lived here. It is easy in a script like this to linger on saints, Vikings, martyrs, and famous men, because their stories have shape. But the ordinary people mattered too. The orchard workers, the miners, the women keeping households together through uncertain wages and dangerous work. The children walking to school past fields that had been farmed for centuries. The ministers recording baptisms and burials. The people who knew when the river was rising before anyone said so. The people who watched blossom open and worried about frost. The people who heard the pit news. The people who stood at the kirk gate after funerals and spoke in practical sentences because grief had to be carried home and tea still had to be made. These are the lives that make a village. Not only the grand moments, the repeated ones. Work, weather, worship, birth, debt, harvest, illness, marriage, burial, the bell, the river, the road. Again and again. As the 20th century moved on, the old patterns changed. Fruit production declined from its height. Glass houses disappeared or changed use. Coal mining receded. Estates altered. Transport improved, and people no longer needed to live where their grandparents had lived. The centre of gravity shifted away from small parish villages and towards towns, roads, employment elsewhere. Dalserf remained, but it became quieter. The quietness, then, is not emptiness. It is aftermath. The village is like a room after a long conversation has ended. The chairs are still there. The warmth has not quite left. You can tell people were present, though their voices are gone. Walk the road now and you can sense it. The cottages neat, the church kept, the graveyard tended, the river still doing what it has always done. But behind the stillness there is a density of vanished labour. Hands that picked fruit, hands blackened by coal, hands that built walls, dug graves, rang bells, lifted coffins, packed produce, mended roofs, opened gates, closed doors. The village was made by hands. Most of those hands are unnamed now. There is something important in allowing this quieter, modern history to stand beside the older, more dramatic stories. Because if we speak only of saints and martyrs, we risk making Dalserf seem like a place that mattered only when famous history touched it. That is not true. Dalserf mattered on ordinary days. It mattered in blossom season. It mattered when the pits were working. It mattered when a child was baptized, when a miner came home, when a crop failed, when a widow opened the door in the morning and looked at the weather. It mattered because people lived here, and living somewhere fully is one of the deepest ways a place becomes significant. The river does not rank stories. It does not say that Wallace matters more than a fruit picker, or Churchill more than a woman washing clothes, or a saint more than a child buried before his first birthday. The river carries all of them. That is its mercy. That is its indifference. So when you stand in Dalserf now and feel the quiet, do not mistake it for absence. Listen more carefully. There is work under that quiet. There is coal dust under that quiet. There is blossom under that quiet. There are vanished voices under that quiet, speaking in the small, practical language of lives that rarely enter national history, but make local history possible. The village grew quiet because the world changed around it, but quiet places are not empty places. Sometimes they are the only places where the older sounds can still be heard. Chapter 11. Churchill in the Pew, the strangest coda. There is one story in Dalserf that feels at first almost out of place. After saints, serpents, Viking stones, bones beneath the floor, Covenanter martyrs, coal, blossom, and the long memory of the Clyde, it seems almost too strange to say that Winston Churchill once sat in the pews of the Auld Grey Mother Kirk. And yet he did. Churchill's connection to Dalserf came through marriage and family. His wife, Clementine Hosier, was linked to the Hosier family of Maudesley Castle, just across the river. James Hosier, a politician and local figure, was connected to the church as benefactor and worshipper. When Churchill visited the family, he came into this valley, and when Sunday came, he entered the small kirk at Dalserf. Try to hold the image without letting the later mythology overwhelm it. Not the wartime Prime Minister yet. Not the voice over the wireless in 1940. Not the bronze statue, the cigar, the defiant phrases carved into national memory. A man in a pew. A visitor. A husband among in-laws. Sitting in a small Lanarkshire church with the Clyde moving nearby and Covenanter graves outside. It is almost comic, and then it is moving, because the place reduces everyone to human scale. That is one of the quiet powers of a small kirk. Famous men become bodies in pews. Prime ministers become listeners. The grand machinery of public life pauses beneath a low roof while a bell rings across fields and the minister begins. What did Churchill notice? Did he notice the memorials? Did he know the depth of the covenanting story in the parish? Did he see the hogback stone? Did he walk in the churchyard and read names softened by weather? Did the river register with him at all, or was it simply part of the scenery of a family visit? We do not know. History often preserves presence without preserving thought. We know he was there. We do not know what Dalserf was to him, but we can imagine what the village did, because the village always does the same thing. It held him briefly, then let him go. That is what Dalserf has done for everyone. It held the prehistoric dead. It held the saint's memory. It held the Viking-age grave. It held the bones beneath the floor. It held Wallace in tradition. It held Arthur Bruce's name after his body was taken to Edinburgh. It held ministers, miners, orchard workers, widows, children, visitors, and one future Prime Minister. Then time moved on. The river carried the next thing. Churchill would go on to become one of the most recognisable figures of the 20th century. Dalserf would remain Dalserf. Small, quiet, easily missed, holding more than it advertised. There is humility in that contrast. A great public life passing briefly through a small, private place. A man who would one day speak to an empire, sitting in a kirk where generations of ordinary people had spoken to God. Perhaps that is the real force of the story. Not celebrity, not novelty. Scale. The scale of a world in which the famous and the forgotten occupy the same pews, walk past the same graves, hear the same bell, and vanish in the end into the same keeping. Dalserf does not become more important because Churchill sat there. That would be the wrong way round. The Churchill story is powerful because Dalserf was already important before he arrived. He entered a place layered with history far older than his own. He sat among stones and memories that did not need his name to matter. The village lent him, briefly, its quiet. Then he left, and the river remained. Epilogue. Dalserf tonight. It is night now, in the Clyde Valley. The A72 is quiet. A few cars pass, their lights sweeping briefly across the hedges and orchard slopes before disappearing into the dark. The turning to Dalserf waits where it always waits, modest and easy to miss, asking nothing from anyone who does not already know to look. At the end of that road, the village is still. The cottages are dark, the church is dark, the kirkyard is darker still, though not empty, never empty. The gravestones stand in their rows, each one holding a name, or the weathered remains of a name, or no readable name at all. Some are upright, some lean. Some have softened so much that the stone seems to have begun returning to the earth from which it came. The covenanting memorial stands among them, its inscription invisible in this darkness, but present nonetheless. Arthur Bruce's name is not lost. The Reverend Macmillan's grave is there, the hogback stone is there, low beside the kirk, its longhouse shape reduced in the dark to a heavier shadow among shadows. And beneath the floor of the church, though the bones found in 1894 were removed, and the floor was remade, and the practical work of building went on, the memory of those bones remains. The living above, the dead below. The oldest truth of the place. And the river is there. The Clyde, moving around the bend in the dark, as water has moved through this valley since the ice withdrew and the land began to breathe again. The sound of it is not loud. That is why you have to listen. It is a low sound, a steady sound, a carrying sound. The kind of sound that can become part of a place so completely that people stop hearing it consciously and only notice its absence when they leave. The saints heard it. The old river people heard it. The Viking-age dead may have heard it before they were laid beneath their house of stone. The builders of the kirk heard it, the covenanters heard it. The people who found the bones beneath the floor heard it. The orchard workers heard it in spring. The miners heard it when they came up from underground. Churchill heard it, whether he noticed or not, when he visited the valley and sat in the pews of the Auld Grey Mother Kirk. The river does not distinguish between them. It carries them all. That may be why Dalserf feels so much larger than it is. Because the village is not merely a collection of cottages and a church, it is an accumulation. A small place made immense by repetition. Water passing, prayer spoken, bodies buried, names remembered, names lost. Spring blossom opening above old graves. Floorboards laid over bones. a stone house for the dead, weathering beside a living kirk. A man taken from the parish and hanged in Edinburgh, yet returned by memory. A future Prime Minister sitting in a pew, briefly no more important than anyone else in the sight of the Auld Grey Mother. Layer on layer, quiet on quiet, the village the river keeps. If you go to Dalserf, and you can go, any day, down the turning off the A72 along the short road to the church, take a moment to stand by the river. Do not hurry. Do not treat it as scenery. Listen. Let the sound of the Clyde settle underneath your thinking. Look at the church. Look at the graveyard. Look at the bend in the land and the way the water seems to hold it. Think of the old mound opened by road builders and the storm that followed. Think of serf or sarf, saint or serpent. Think of the lost kingdom beneath the orchards. Think of the hogback stone, that little longhouse for someone whose name has gone. Think of the bones beneath the floor. And then remember that for all the history we can name, most of what happened here will never be recovered. Most lives leave no document. Most grief leaves no monument. Most prayers vanish as soon as they are spoken. Most names, given enough time, are carried away. But not everything is lost. Some things remain in the shape of a place, in a bend of water, in a field name, in a stone, in the silence around an old kirk at night. The field of the saint, the field of the serpent. Perhaps, after everything, both. Perhaps the saint and the serpent are only two ways of saying that this ground has always been more than it appears. One name for blessing, one name for the older darkness. Both true enough in their way, both held by the same river. The village is quiet now. The church is dark, the road is empty, but the river is moving. It has not finished speaking. It never has. Thank you for listening to Quietly Reflective. If you have stayed with this journey through Dalserf, through the river, the kirk, the stones, the saints, the shadows, and the old stories beneath the floor, I hope it has given you a quiet place to rest for a little while. Places like this remind us that life is layered, that memory matters, that even the smallest village can hold more than it ever says aloud. So wherever you are tonight, take care of yourself gently. Let the day loosen its grip. And when you are ready, may you carry a little of this quiet with you. This has been Quietly Reflective. Quiet thoughts for a noisy world.